Thank you. Thank you, Hal. Welcome, everyone, to the opening plenary of the symposium. We're really thrilled to have Dr. Monika Winarnita, Associate Professor Aim Sinpeng, and Dr. George B. Radics, who will be with us for about an hour or so to explore how influencer cultures intersect with gender politics in Southeast Asia. We hope this conversation will set the tone for the exciting four panels to come, offering critical insights into how influencers construct, challenge, and negotiate gender norms in the region. Our speakers, I'm sure, and as you will all see, will bring rich and complementary perspectives from law and politics to media, performance, and everyday life. This plenary will take the form of a moderated conversation. We'll go for around 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll follow with a Q&A with you, the audience. And before we start, let me introduce each of our speakers. First, we have Dr. Monika Winarnita. Dr. Monika Winarnita is a lecturer in Indonesian and Asian Studies at the Asia Institute, University of Melbourne. She did her PhD in anthropology at the Australian National University, or ANU, with the Sir Raymond Firth Thesis Prize. Monika's publications and research interests include ethnography of the Indonesian and Malay diaspora, gender and cultural performance, as well as migration, digital life, and precarious work. Her book, based on her PhD thesis titled Dancing the Feminine, Gender and Identity Performances by Indonesian Migrant Women, was published by Liverpool University Press and University of Chicago Press in 2016, and the book was awarded the distinctive monograph of distinction by the University of Victoria, BC, Canada in 2017. Next, we have Associate Professor Aim Sinpeng. Aim is Associate Professor in Comparative Politics in the discipline of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. She's currently a DECRA Fellow for her project on cyber repression and political protest in Thailand. Her research interests center on the relationships between digital media and political participation in Southeast Asia. She's particularly interested in the issues of social media campaigning, disinformation, online harassment, and AI bias. Her books include Opposing Democracy in the Digital Age, The Yellow Shirts in Thailand, published by University of Michigan Press in 2021, and From Grassroots Activism to Disinformation, Social Media in Southeast Asia with Ross Tapsell, published by ICES in 2021. And finally, we have Dr. George B. Radics from the National University of Singapore. George is a social-legal scholar who researches and writes on crime, criminal justice, and human rights. His specific topics of interest include sexuality and race. As a sociologist, his work often engages in the fields of sociology of emotions and social theory. George is also a lawyer who has worked for the courts, and he is interested in judicial procedures, legislative history, and especially how legal structures impact the lives of marginal communities. And his first book, really exciting, Emotional Filipinos, The American Myth of the Lazy Native and Islamic Separatism in the Philippines, is currently under contract. All right, now let's move on to the discussion plenary part of the plenary session. I'll start with my first question for Aim, Monika, and George. Many Southeast Asian societies are marked by collectivist and perhaps conservative social norms, as you all know. But it is also a region with really exciting, rapidly expanding digital cultures where social media clearly play a really prominent role. I mean, the latest book by Professor Melina Lim shows how social media engagement in Southeast Asia has surpassed the global average. So my question to the three of you is, how do you see the roles of influencers as both cultural producers and political actors in everyday gender contestations in Southeast Asia? Would you want to have a start, Aim, maybe? And then we can move to Monika and George.
Thanks so much for having me. Since I'm starting, I actually want to challenge this notion that somehow we're collectivist culture, because I don't think that's true anymore.
Mm.
And this is very clear if you're looking at decades of results on the World Value Survey, where there's just been a really significant shift in the latest survey between 2017 to 2022, that in fact we are seeing a shift away from collectivist thinking, particularly amongst young people. And so young people in countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand are actually the most likely to prioritize self-expression and pursuing personal goals rather than following, family values and what have you. And there is actually a little bit of a gender difference as well. So women across the region are much more likely to be collectivist than men, but the more important marker of um, propensity to be more individualistic is actually not gender, but income. So countries with a higher income, particularly and very notably Singapore, is far more likely, both for men and women across all age group, to be more individualistic. It's also a country that has the highest, internet penetration and what have you. So I think that the region is really changing. There seems to be an age component to this, but also income component that are making us question whether we really are collectivists. And we see this manifested. This is the second point I'm trying to make, actually in voting behavior. For the longest time, I think in a number of different countries, and as we know, Southeast Asia is a region that's primarily non-democratic region, but we do have competitive elections in across number of countries. And there are certain countries that have very stable political outcomes. So the same parties in power for a long time, most notably Cambodia, Singapore, Vietnam, Laos. But other countries that do get governmental change. And when you look at the countries that do get governmental change, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and to a less extent, Myanmar, you start to try to understand, how people voted and who were the actual influencers. And we do find that countries that are more like where people are more likely for the people to more likely to follow political news, find out about candidates or party policy on their own terms, are more likely to vote on their own rather than voting with the family. So across a number of surveys that I've done recently in the past 5 years on elections, the Philippines is the most likely to be voting with family members, even though they're also the most engaged in terms of number of hours spent on social media. So we cannot make an automatic assumption that the longer you spend on social media, the more likely you're going to be more individualistic in some way or drawn to influencers that are not your family members. Because, voting decision is a different activity than following someone for humor or entertainment. So, 3 points I want to make. One is I really want to challenge that collectivist identity that we have. I don't think that's true anymore. And there are more nuances across countries, across age group, across income level that we need to look at. And secondly, that we're not, the amount of time we spend social media does not necessarily mean we are influenced by digital influencers in the same way on the same topic, right? And the last point I make is that the level of conservatism, it really depends on the issue. And that's, I think, cuts across a number of countries. So we look at countries that support women in politics, right? So we look at the issue of gender and politics. We actually find that there has been a regression in the support for women in politics in majority Muslim states amongst young people, which is the exact opposite trend for non-Muslim majority countries amongst young people. So we're thinking that young people, the digital natives in some way grew up in internet and social media, they're probably more likely to be individualistic and more likely to be potentially influenced by influencers, don't necessarily actually have progressive ideas. Some of them have more conservative ideas compared to their counterparts who are spend far less. So Indonesia and Malaysia in particular have seen noticeable decline amongst young people in support for women in politics. And that's a very fascinating trend that I think I wanted to bring about. So that's for me, yeah.
Thank you so much, Aim. That was such an excellent start to answer this very first question of our plenary. Monica, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, that's very interesting actually. I did look at that word and go, collectivist individuals is quite binary, right? But I suppose, and it's really interesting that you talked about the countries such as Indonesia and Malaysia having more conservative voting patterns, youth particularly not voting for women. This is really, really interesting. Now, I'm looking at it more from an Indonesian kind of examples because that's sort of what I do is lecturing in Indonesian and Asian studies, and also have a background in anthropology. So I'm looking at how these Indonesian sort of influences, right, which may also differently in Southeast Asia, reflect differently in Southeast Asia, both cultural producers and political actors, right? That's the question there. And I suppose in terms of cultural producers, right, I feel that the influences, they do shape aesthetics, language, and norms, you know. So what influencers do is, you know, they have this kind of curation of aspirational lifestyles and identities. And through platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And in terms of Indonesia, this includes everything from popularizing like modest fashion within Islamic frameworks to queering beauty standards in urban youth culture, right? So they become sort of these arbiters of desirable, acceptable, and transgressive everyday gender expression. So I'm coming from anthropology here. I'm looking at it. How do they impact on everyday contestation of gender? And then in terms of being a political actor, I think they're increasingly becoming political actors, whether intentionally or not. Now, what is really interesting about Indonesia is that in the last election that we had in 2024, so we're talking here about voting patterns before, about 20 influencers, um, they were elected, and they now have a seat in Indonesia's parliament. So out of 580 politicians, 20 of them are actually influencers. And unfortunately, the Indonesian sort of voters voted for them because they were familiar through social media, right? Because they were more familiar than these unknown sort of politicians. But it's not about their political stance. It's about their personal lives and sort of lifestyle, that they're just popular. And something that a colleague, media studies colleague, Ross Tapsell, like he was talking about the election and how 20 influencers are now, you know, members of parliament. He was like, well, it's there's nothing wrong with that. But the problem with Indonesian influencers is that they're the ones that disseminate disinformation the most, and it's when and now they have received backlash already online because, you know, it's all about the lifestyle, the image, of taking photos, you know, with dignitaries, but there's no content. They're not, they don't even know their political kind of parties policies, or, you know, they're not promoting gender ideology, they're not promoting gender kind of issues either. So the most influential influencer in Indonesia, Raffi Ahmad, he became like a minister of youth and culture, I think. I mean, in Indonesia, right, 52% of Indonesians are youth. So this is 18 to 39 years old. So this is a huge number, right? So it is a young demographic as well. So he's quite influential. So he became this special minister because he sort of voted, well, he voted and he promoted the right candidate who then became president. But he got a backlash because he was tone deaf to the kind of economic situation that is happening now, you know, not only in Indonesia, but everywhere else as well. And, you know, he very much promoted his sort of image as being part of this sort of heteronormative cisgender. Him and his wife are like the main kind of influences, the influences with the largest following, right? So he's got this sort of very much valued ideal image of gender in Indonesia, but no other kind of political sort of ideals, or he's not promoting any sort of gender rights or anything like that. So none of these sort of influences are. However, they do engage with issues like, besides the politician who became influencers who became politicians, influencers do talk about sort of gender equality, LGBTIQ rights, sexual harassment, and body autonomy, right, in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, but really through highly kind of personalized and aestheticized lens, right? So they do have the ability to impact on this sort of gender politics specifically, and progressive gender roles in relationship. They talk about that, or speak out against moral policing, or these sort of different kind of gender identity. But sometimes they spark, like the influencers who became politicians, backlash, right, or support. So an example I wanted to just sort of provide is an article I co-wrote in 2022 about fashioning gender in Asia and beyond. There were two types of Indonesian influencers. One is the Indonesian policewoman. Right. So they had to undergo rigorous standards of beauty, height, weight, skin complexion, and also virginity testing to become a policewoman. So they have, once they become policewomen, they have like 100,000 social media followers. So they become influencers, but they promote this idealized state-sanctioned femininity. Right. At the same time, I wrote about this queering beauty standards in urban youth subculture I mentioned before, and this is portrayed around the same time in the capital city of Jakarta. There was this street fashion called Citayam. Like Citayam is this district in the capital city of Jakarta, and they have this street fashion. This is urban youth. They're from lower socioeconomic background, and they do zebra fashion parade, of street fashion, right? But what they did, and there was this backlash because they become viral, right, online, and become influencers on street fashion. But what was considered transgressive was this feminine attire of the male teen influencers, right? So they got this online backlash. So whether or not they were intentionally making a gender political statement about LGBTIQ rights or body autonomy, it's not really clear. But what is interesting is how this then is copied in other urban regions of Indonesia. And there was this sort of zebra catwalk fashion show of queer youth, right? And together with policewomen who were directing traffic. So there's like this combination of idealized state sanctioned femininity with transgressive queer gender performance. And it's just this sort of example of everyday consultation of gender through the role of influencers of both culture producers and political actors. So they are able to become that, whether or not intentionally they are trying to make a statement about the politics of gender kind of expressions and contestation in Indonesia. So I'm just going to end it with that, and George, speak next.
Thanks, Monika. George?
Well, first off, thank you, Dr. Anissa and Dr. Crystal and Dr. Howe for having me. Just listening to Dr. Aim and Dr. Monika's research it's so fascinating. And I completely agree that I think culture is a lot more dynamic and a lot more complex than these categories that we sometimes put it in. Singapore likes to portray itself as collectivist and Asian as a way to set itself apart from the West. But as Dr. A mentions, the statistics and the data doesn't support that. And I think social media, because it is also very dynamic and changing, as we see from a lot of the work that Dr. Monika is doing, it is actually more aligned with how people actually live their lives, even if it may be a little bit more spectacular, or it may be more extreme. In my own work, over the last 2 years, I've been interviewing LGBT human rights activists across Southeast Asia. And I found that social media plays a very important role in terms of providing people with a perspective and with an outlet that maybe allows them to live the lifestyle that they want to live, even if they're in these small communities in rural parts of the country. They can still access a community, they can access lifestyles, they can make friends, they can find love, they can make money off of social media. And so this is really transforming uh, the lives of queer people to a certain extent. Whereas I would say a few decades ago, and when you interview people along age lines, some would say, I have to go to the city center in order to have the life that I want to live so I can escape this oppressive place. Now, um, because of influencers, because of the internet, because of social media, that isn't so much the case. Now, with that said, even if culturally there's a lot more dynamism and this whole collectivist versus individualist culture falls apart, as Dr. Nisa mentioned, as a sociolegal scholar, we can't deny that there are certain kind of hard institutions that many of these queer people that I interview they butt up against. So, for instance, um, I've been doing a lot of research because I did that 105 interviews with queer activists, and I'm still doing these interviews. I've engaged in a few different projects. One was on abortions and how access to abortion, and so in countries like the Philippines where it's illegal, um, being able uh, to find resources, being able to figure out alternative plans, how to deal with your situation, because these resources available online, it does uh, allow them a pathway around some of these hard institutional rules that say we are an Asian society, we are a Catholic society, and therefore you shall not divorce your partner, or you shall not have an abortion, or any of those things. Um, in one of my recent projects, which I'll be presenting at the Law and Society Conference in Chicago in a few weeks' time, I interviewed mature content um, producers, mature content online producers. And what I found was that um, even if the reality is people are uh, we're not this collectivist conservative Asian society that is very prudish when it comes to sexuality. Much like anywhere else in the world, you got all different colors of the rainbow, all different things that turn you on. And so I interviewed some really interesting people, but because our laws, which ironically are Western and individualistic, have been interpreted as collectivist and quote unquote Asian, I saw very distinct patterns. So for instance, I interviewed both male and female online mature content producers. And for the males, they felt that the laws were there to protect them. They felt that if they followed the law um, will prevent against crime. They're not doing anything wrong, um, and the law is fair and the law is just. But for the female online mature content producers, they felt that there was a high chance that they could get doxxed. There's a high chance that they could be harassed. And in fact, when they are harassed or when they are doxxed and they report it to the police, um, they find it very challenging to get the police to believe them. Oftentimes, they think that they there's a double victimization where because you are putting yourself out there, you deserve to be harassed, right? And women should be chaste and pure. They shouldn't be doing these types of things. So because the laws themselves have been interpreted in this quote unquote collectivist framework where men are the offenders and women are the victims, and men can be sexually aggressive and women have to be pure and chaste. It gets interpreted in the laws and how the laws protect people in different ways. Now, of course, it's also changing. I found in my interviews that younger people tend to be a little bit more risk tolerant. And I think since younger people are much more open to putting their lives online, they see it much more instrumentally. They don't mind putting their sexuality out there or showing their body as long as they can push the line and get close to breaking the rules, but they're okay with that. Whereas I think for older generations who are online, they feel that there's a little bit more shame attached to it. There's a little bit more, I don't want people to know about my personal life. So I think there is a lot to be said about how social media is transforming these notions of Western versus Asian, collectivist versus individualistic. We're much more complex on the ground. It's a much more dynamic culture that we're seeing in Asia as well as the rest of the world. But I guess when it comes to legal institutions, political institutions that sometimes are hard and that are imbued with power, it's hard to there's a tension between this dynamic culture and these hard institutions that people butt up against. So I guess that's how I'd answer that.
Right. Thank you so much. And I really like that we started by problematizing these labels and how they play out in different, not only societies, but also at different levels and also at different interests. And I want us to perhaps move a bit, but also still look at that and think about the transmissions, perhaps, of gender knowledge and ideologies. We've mentioned the societies that we work in, that the three of you focus on. I wonder if you could comment on how influencers can influence, or maybe how they are influenced by local and transnational gender politics, perhaps within Southeast Asia or beyond Southeast Asia. I guess there's been a lot of conversations. The three of you mentioned this about individual is often labeled as Western sort of values. But if you could comment on that sort of transmission of gender knowledge and ideologies and largely the politics within and beyond Southeast Asia, that would be great. Maybe we'll start with Monika and then we'll move to George and then Aim. Monika, please.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so it's really interesting, right? So again, you think of this sort of how influences are influenced. It depends on, again, their how they're part of this sort of affective economy, right? So it's also attention economy. So they wanted to get likes, right? They want to get likes, they want to get followers. And to do that, they have to appeal to a general kind of audience, right? To more general kind of audience. So there's always this kind of tension about who their audiences are and what are they promoting, what makes them popular, right? So what kind of attention are they going to get? And there was this really interesting kind of research. I did a little bit of homework before I came here in Indonesia, and how influencers who promote sort of products and sort of marketable to an Indonesian audience in Indonesian, they're trying to appeal to the general audience in Indonesia. They would have more kind of conservative sort of, women as passive housekeeper, men as dominant, kind of aggressive masculinity, like really, really, really stereotype. But when they're using English, right, in their promotion, and they're trying to go sort of beyond Indonesia, or they're marketing to an audience that they could see as or English speaking, then that kind of gender equality, so then there's that change. It's not that really kind of polarized sort of, stereotype. And so women can be working, being outside the house, and men can, participate in the domestic sort of sphere as well. So it's just this really interesting sort of research that I saw, and that they on Indonesian influences. I think it was by our colleagues in UGM, Universitas Gadjah Mada. So on the one hand, it just depends. I think also one is on, who their audiences are, how they get this sort of attention economy, right? How they become influencers, and whether or not, they are then influenced by like transnational trends. We're talking about Western media, do they want to use that within their kind of messaging? Do they promote individualism, self-expression, gender fluidity, in platforms like TikTok, Instagram, so these are like global platforms, right? Do the influencers adopt and adapt these sort of global gender discourses, and do they blend them with local values? So I think it's really interesting how influencers, particularly from Southeast Asia or Indonesia, can really make their content more kind of relatable if they blend it and in a way create this sort of hybrid space, this sort of Homi Bhabha's third space, right? Maybe something new can emerge from that. But there's also always this tension, right? In terms of whether they're trying to, who they're trying to appeal, what is their image, what would get them maintain their influencer status as well, right? So it's about sort of how they can negotiate, and do they reshape those sort of gender norms through digital platforms. So there is the space there, almost like a third space. The digital platform becomes this sort of third space, but you can have this where you're trying to negotiate the local and the global and the transnational, and yeah, I think that's how it would be really interesting to see more and more sort of work in this space. I know your work, Anissa, you talk about social media religious influences, right? And then how they kind of blend. You're talking about religious identity, you're talking about political, and you're talking about that commercial element I was mentioning before, right? On these social media religious influencer. This is sort of your work, correct me if I'm wrong, and how, the young Muslim women you work with, they have to remain and take part in this prevailing gender regime, right? They've got to maintain female sort of conformity, but they've also got political ideas, like they're trying to challenge that in a way. So this is sort of the research has been happening there. And I think Evanissa's work and anthropologists also look at female Muslim youth influences, and how they want it to become more virtuous. There's this performance of both gender and religious identity that is probably influenced also with transnational. So there's a transnational sort of religious ideals that they're trying to promote, like a gender one as well. So how do they then kind of negotiate this? And depends, like for example, Evanissa's work on specifically Muslim youth female influencers who wanted to be virtuous, that's their audience, right? So that's the kind of image that they're trying to promote, and they're trying to engage with transnational kind of ideas, but these are transnational religious ideas, right? So I suppose I'll end it with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Monika. How about you, George? What do you think?
I mean, to add to Monica's points, I think she talked about kind of this transnational space where people can push in terms of. She referred to your work in Muslim female influencers. Maybe I'll start with the tension that I saw in in the interviews that I've done. First of all, like when you talk to LGBTQ human rights people throughout Southeast Asia, um, I did a lot of the interviews in English because I found that English was the one. Like I can speak maybe 2 languages of Southeast Asia. I can't speak all of them, but what was consistent was that many of the activists that I spoke to said that in order to really communicate across borders, you kind of had to use English. But then there was that second layer of tension, which is then how do you take these terms like queer and then find local definitions that make sense for the population. And I think that is where the tension emerges because Southeast Asia was a literal battleground for ideological beliefs from the Cold War to the war on terrorism. We're constantly what is the saying where like the grasshoppers that have to deal with the elephants. Now it's going to be US and China, right? And some of my work now, just Ukraine disrupted financing of projects. The Trump is disrupting financing of projects. And so local populations have to grapple with that. But many countries deal with this tension in different ways. So, for instance, I would say Vietnam, Singapore, and Malaysia tend to be a lot more um, uh, uh, resistant towards quote unquote Western beliefs. Whereas I think some countries that I've encountered, like Cambodia, they were very open to gender mainstreaming. They're very open to LGBT rights mainstreaming, but this was uh, funder led, right? So maybe this is the USAID is going to step in and say, we have a project on gender mainstreaming, and local organizations will jump to kind of implement it. But when the funding is pulled, then that the progress there is pulled as well. Whereas I think Thailand and the Philippines, they both are a little bit more flexible. They're a little more syncretic. I don't want to typify all the countries in different ways, but in terms of the reception, the translation, the rejection of quote unquote Western beliefs and values, it is very tense, and it is very diverse. But I think just to echo what Monika was saying, I think there are important third spaces where local activists can use social media as a way to push their vision of how the world should look. Um, and I'm learning from all of you because I was mainly looking at activism, not so much in terms of social media, but I would encounter a lot of um, human rights activists who would say, I want to be a social media influencer. I want to put myself out there as the spokesperson for my community. Um, and and many times they are able to kind of generate a following and build their, I don't know, brand is the right word, but they're able to kind of put themselves out there as a spokesperson, and then they get invited to talks, and then suddenly um, that just these moments where they're sharing or venting or explaining what it's like to be a trans person in Thailand or in Brunei or in the Philippines turns into opportunities for them to share their story, not just online, but in the real world space, and connect with other people and form not just online connections, but offline connections as well. So I think that there is a tension with regards to these Western versus local terms and concepts and ideas. But there's also a third space where people can take uh, take what's out there, explain their own position on it, and put it back into the world for people to consume and grow from and take part in. So yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, George. And do you want to add anything to Monica's and George's answer?
Oh, they're great, excellent answer. I want to bring attention to this idea of the process of becoming influenced. And I think we can learn from psychology, actually, about how the minds work. And so when it comes to the issue of gender politics, the issue of gender identity and politics is across the board in Southeast Asian region, a controversial, often censored topic in a number of different ways. So when you're looking at how to be influenced by or influence someone on a controversial topic, we can think about it as an idea of cognitive dissonance. So you basically bring an uncomfortable issue, right? And a successful influencer could bring authority and knowledge to discussing something that is otherwise quite controversial. And this is important because this process tends to unfold in very subtle ways over long periods of time. And what stands out in places like Southeast Asia is that this occurs also in often restrictive environment, where direct advocacy of an issue or overt confrontation tends not to work because they're faced by repression and stigmatization or marginalization. So the subtle way in which this whole cognitive dissonance, so influencers bringing talking about controversial idea, and trying to nudge the public attitude towards changing the behavior requires time, but also requires the creation of safe space to open up and talk about it. And so how do we do this over time when the environment, information environment, is constantly subject to censorship in a number of different areas? And so you look at the different strategies that influencers use over time. It's often relating to making the idea more familiar, so normatizing the idea. You often through groups, so individual strategy doesn't always work. Using strategies like humor in particular, but also the everyday display of or discussion of these issues, trying to normalize it. So instead of, it's always somebody talking about it. And I think social media really provides opportunities for ordinary people who care about the issue to regularly engage with it. And so when you look at that process of influencing someone, influencer, it's not about who's going viral, but I think you really had to step back and look at it across a much longer term period. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens in a number of different ways. It's often very subtle because you're trying to change a behavioral attitude towards an issue that's controversial, that we don't often talk openly about. And I think that's in direct contrast to understanding how to become an influencer in Western society where there is actual press freedom or freedom of speech, or that particular topics like sexuality, like Josh mentioned, isn't constantly censored by the state and platform at the same time. So I really think that we need to really unpack and really challenge the Western-centric idea of the process of becoming an influencer, because the environments that are operating in Southeast Asia is very different. And there's different sort of, push and pull points about what can be discussed and how to become an influencer isn't like a playbook that we can use across the world. Yes, there will be some commonalities. The issue of platform algorithms that basically prioritize English language content. That's a constant sort of, barriers, which means that it significantly disadvantaged societies that don't speak English, as George mentioned here, right? With Singaporeans and Filipinos being much more likely to be able to influence others in the region because they do speak more English. But there's also local kind of restrictions and regional restrictions that really limit the entire process. It's already heavily mediated of someone becoming an influencer and how to influence a controversial topic like gender politics. So when you see success stories, very successful stories, as George kind of mentioned about, for example, LGBTQ rights in Thailand, you really have to go back decades and be like, they've been talking about this for decades, right? The activism was decades old. But what's the game changer here? And whether social media was a game changer? And what and in which way? So did it expand the space? This is kind of going to the third question, expand the space to normalize a topic to more people? Did it allow activists to reframe or reshape the way we talk about LGBTQ rights that were not available before because there were no longer media gatekeepers, right? Because now you can just create your own content. And even if so, even there's a social support for queer rights, there's decades of activism. The real fundamental change in legislation, or even having the first gay MP being elected, still took decades. And those are really related to the fact that influencers do have to operate within the existing institutions and the restriction that occur in each country. And I think that requires really in-depth local understanding as well. You don't just transfer ideas and influence someone because the process said, if you do this way, if you spend this money on Facebook ads, or if you craft it this way, it will work. It doesn't always work because it has to work within the local limitations. And so going back to the understanding the process of becoming influenced and basically being influenced by, I do think that it's not just marketing. If it is, everyone would be an influencer. It's not. It's about little things that really matter, like, language issue. The fact that certain words cannot be written because they get removed by the platform. Or about, how to tap into cultural identities that are different across countries. So in that instant, I do think that Southeast Asia has a wealth of models that we can offer to the rest of the world of how to become an influencer in restricted media environment, how to become influencer in non-English, speaking countries, and still being able to advance very critical social progress. Like we see, same-sex marriage and other issues that George mentioned. Yeah.
Mm. That was really perfect, Amen. Because I mean, the whole symposium that we have, and we're going to see presenters talking about it, will attempt to detail the excellent questions you posed just now on how Southeast Asia does have a wealth of very different models on what influencers can be, how they are shaped or constructed, and what they can really mean in the societies. And I know we originally have 4 questions prepared for our panel, but the time has come for us to open the floor to the audience, and we already have a few questions for you. And so also for everyone else in the audience, we're moving on now to the Q&A session. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to type questions for our plenary speakers, and you can feel free to indicate which speaker you want to address, or if you want everyone to answer. And so I'm just going to move on now, really mindful of the limited time we have, to the questions we already received in the Q&A. I'm going to read out a question from Sanskriti Sharma. They say, thank you, lovely panelists. I have a general question for anyone who may like to answer. So Dr. Monika mentioned influencers' choice of content type depends on their understanding of how promising an attention economy would be. So stringing from this, Sanskriti is interested to know how influencers measure their potential rewards, given 2 possibilities. One, whether or not they contribute to the normative gender norms, or whether or not they challenge the gender norms. And what do you think about their sometimes deliberate generation of an anti-fan base, or whatever this decision may follow socioculturally? Who would like to attempt to answer this question first from Sanskriti? Monika, do you want to volunteer for us, and then we can move on to AIM and then George?
I'm reading this question now, and I don't actually know how they measure their potential rewards. I haven't actually, done. I would like to do field work with influencers, but so the work that I've done is really mainly looking at media kind of reporting when influencers have become prominent in the media of their social backlash. So that would be really interesting, actually. I think this is sort of one of your questions that didn't get asked, Anissa, about what further research can we do, sort of like, and I think this sort of interdisciplinary research, definitely, probably you may have done this more so about, the digital ethnography as well as, face to face, being involved in the lives of influencers, asking them, what really, how do you measure this potential reward? Do they contribute normative gender norm, or do they challenge them? I suppose it depends on the audience as well, right? Like, for example, I think George and I was talking a lot about activists, and George was saying, maybe activists could be influencers. That's where he's coming from. LGBTIQ activists who are influencers, and the ones that I've done in terms of publishing with other co-authors is looking at influencers who are already, popular figures in Indonesia. So they were like singers, and or they already had that kind of following, so they were more into normative kind of gender norms instead of challenging them, because they don't want to lose that kind of general audience where who they are is part of that. Like I was talking about Rafi Ahmad and his wife, or in my article on influencing the influencers, which is about the regulation of morality, and how the backlash really is the one. I think I was talking about, a lot of it is sort of kind of repressive environment where, like, particularly like the Indonesian government, you have the ITE laws, although that's not really doing much in terms of influencers who are already either paid for by the government to promote the government. So this is the Indonesian context. They're paid by the government to promote government kind of political kind of projects, such as the new capital Nusantara. But then, so they push that kind of ideas by the government because they are being paid by the government. Or the one that I did on influencing the influences with other co-authors is during COVID-19 time, all this sort of government restriction, and how they're kind of promoting that. So, it's really interesting. It's not just that influencers are individuals, or they have brands, or they have commercial interests, but in Indonesian case, they are also particularly popular figures already, who are singers or film stars. They then become a part of the political landscape, right? So they're being paid for by the politicians, and then that becomes more kind of contributing to more of that normative gender norm. So yeah, that's my answer to that. Not sure whether that answers the question, but just to begin the conversation so the others can jump in.
Yes. Aim or George, do you want to jump in to answer that question?
I mean, maybe I can just really quickly. I was trying to think through some examples from my own research, and I really wanted to follow up on Aim's point because I learned so much from her in terms of like the regulation of fake news in Southeast Asia, and these hard constructs. But perhaps that can be a side conversation. Back to the question, I was looking in terms of pushing boundaries. And in terms of the what was it? The attention economy. When I was working with online mature content producers, there was this interesting third space where I guess at one point anime was considered not political and not problematic. And so there was this opportunity for people to engage in anime and I forgot what it's called, but when cosplay. And so as cosplayers, you can change gender. It's just normal. And some of these online mature content producers were cosplayers that found that they could actually generate more following and generate more income if they started to take off their clothes. And for some of them, they were okay with that. They thought that this was fun. They make money off of it. They're making followings. So I do think that to a certain extent, when there is this space where, for instance, anime or cosplay is considered apolitical and it is not problematic, and it of like escapes some of these hard institutions, it does pose a potential for people to gender bend and to kind of introduce alternative versions of sexuality that somehow slips through the cracks. So there is potential there, I think. Yeah.
Hmm. And maybe just to, this is a great question that might follow up on that, and Aim mentioned about safe space as well. This is from Lasmi Raspati. So Lasmi says, currently there's an openly gay Indonesian influencer living abroad with his Western husband. Surprisingly, most of the comments of his content come from Indonesian women who find comfort in discussing taboo topics. This has created a new kind of safe space in everyday life, where straight women feel more at ease talking about private matters with a gay influencer, showing that connection goes beyond shared sexual orientation. What do you think about this? Do you want to do you want to try to answer this, Aim? Because you mentioned about safe space. Mhm.
There's a number of different ways to create safe space, and that's the great question. And one of the things that young people are really good at actually is to create a new language, new terms that they use to talk about certain topics. And we know this because this comes up even for elections, when they're campaigning for certain issues, or when they're trying to bring up controversial topics, that there's particular language created for the young digital natives that even for me, like I have to talk to my niece who's 13 and be like, what does that mean? And this comes up a lot with hashtag activism as well. It's a way to create a turf for like-minded people to create in a public space, right? Either on X or in other platform, like TikTok, for example, where it does apply exclusionary, because if you're like above a certain age, you don't know what it means. So you have to ask all the young people. But it's a really natural way of creating that safe space. And I think like queer people have been doing this for years, right? There's certain terms and languages. And I think that's such a clever way of, really using your language to create that safe space in an open space in some ways. You have to like really get it to understand. And most state authorities are like middle-aged people and up. So they're really out of touch with digital youth stuff. So either they rely on their really young, if they're that progressive and visionary, they would like start trying to understand digital youth culture, but most of them don't. And it's a great way to fly under the radar in a very open place, especially if you're talking about sexuality and stuff like that. And we have examples of this all across the region as well, to create safe space through the playing around with language. And in fact, playing around with language is also great because the platform algorithms haven't caught up with it yet, and now they don't even do content moderation. So you can kind of really skate through. And prior to like, if you look historically at the first decade of when the internet and social media particularly arrived in the region, especially in places that have low internet connection to begin with, you see an explosion of innovation and creation of safe space when the government haven't caught up to repressing it yet. And it's like this, even on blogs in Cambodia, on Myanmar, where that was at one point less than 1% of the population had internet access. So you really see that we have had history of doing this before, for years on a number of different things, different types of platform as well. So I feel like one of the best things that we could offer the world is like how to get around repression. We've gotten really good at it on lots of different issues. And because the line is blurred and moves sometimes, you don't know what's allowed, what's not allowed. But we do know that if you're from certain, and this is something I want to bring up as well, if you are from particular identity groups, you can do a risk rating scale of what type of influencers are most likely to get trolled, right? And I've done this when looking at politicians. What type of politicians most likely to get trolled when campaigning across 4 countries in the region? And we know that if your risk profile is high, so in the case of political campaigning, if you're gay and Muslim, you're the most likely to get trolled, right? Harassment is extremely high. Second to that is if you are Muslim and female, and you in fact get trolled by other Muslim persons. So this is actually also true for Malaysia, which you think, oh wait, I thought Muslim being the majority, but in fact they get the most hate. Women and gay in particular for being too outspoken and not wearing hijab properly or whatever it is. And so I think one of the things we can do, and this should be getting updated, but we can do a risk profile of the types of influencers that are most likely to attract antisocial behavior and in what ways. And in some ways, I think you walk into, if you're going to become an influencer, and we understand that there's all these nuances and restrictions in our region and in our country, what kind of topics you raise the flag of being higher risk, what identity that you portray online are most likely to, and then so we kind of, I think, look at the space and think, okay, if you are going to create a safe space, but you're talking about a high-risk issue and you portray yourself this way, just so you know, you will get hated and trolled. And if so, what are resources available? What are the ways in which we can kind of reduce that risk profile a little bit without, without having to walk back on what we want to advocate on? Or maybe, we do. I don't know. Everybody has different risk tolerance level, right? And the risk goes so far as going to jail, right? So this is the most prominent case for politicians in Thailand and Myanmar. And that the risk, because I look at politicians campaigning, so the risk kind of goes further down. When it gets to the hate and stuff, it's, you can maybe you can put up with trolling. Maybe you are not okay with it. Maybe you're like, that's okay, but I don't want to go to jail. So, everybody kind of walks into this space understanding the risk better. So I think creating safe space comes together with understanding the risk profile. And I think we need a more comprehensive understanding of what's risky, what's not, and the risk kind of get adjusted over time so that we can better see and visualize safe space in each of our countries and across the region.
Right. Thank you so much. That was such an excellent note, Aim. And that pretty much wraps up our plenary session. The time just flew by really quickly. And I hope everyone can join me in giving a big thanks to Aim, George, and Monika for really, really exciting and insightful discussion. I really didn't want it to end, to be honest. But now we'll take a short break for everyone. And when we return, we'll start with panel 1, which will be moderated by Dr. Hao Zheng. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, George, Aim, and Monika, and see you all shortly.